Hello, well I'm continuing my shoemaking journey today and I've got my wooden lasts all done, so I'm going to be making the patterns next. Now I'm going to try a couple of different methods for doing the patterns and see how they look. And the first one I'm going to use is the masking tape method. And I'll take you through that, but basically I'll cover this in masking tape and then draw my pattern on and cut it off, etc. The other thing I have done is I had got hold of some old shoes in my size, and I completely pulled them apart, and I popped a film up showing you about pulling them apart. And so I've got these, which I have tested on the last. I think they're okay. They seem a very similar sort of fit. I'm worrying that they might be a tad looser, but I'm going to use this as a pattern to an extent as well. So I've got the two things really. I'll have the patterns that I make using the masking tape method, and then I can compare that to this kind of pattern by taking these bits apart and mincing it around a bit. So I'll see how I go, and I'll do separate patterns for the liner and for the exterior of the shoe. And the reason for that partly is I don't want to have seams where they'll rub on sort of harder bits of your foot. So I want to keep the lining to be a different sort of shape and style to the outer. So there you are, I will get going. I'll just briefly show you this once again. So this is the shoe I took apart, and it's quite useful because I can immediately see here it's the right sort of size, which I'm quite pleased about. So there you are, that's the one I took apart. So masking tape method, what I'm going to do, I've got some ordinary painter's masking tape. This particular one is by 3M, but it's pretty standard stuff, about 1.25 inches wide, something like that. And I'm going to mask over the shoe. What I'll do, I'll put masking tape all over the top of the shoe, and I'll do it in 3 sort of separate layers. So I'm going to avoid the sole itself, but I'm going to start by putting the tape as best I can, and not to get too many puckers. I'll try and trim the odd bit. I'm going to do some tape over the front, tape over the back, and then sort of around here to get a sort of bit of the initial lines on here. Pressing it down, and the idea with the masking tape will be to like laminate it. So the first bit, after I've done these little sort of stress points as I call them, like the toe, the heel and the side top here, I will then put all the masking tape in one direction for the first layer, then the other direction for the other layer, and then back to the other direction sort of thing. So it's a bit like plywood. You'll get the strength of different layers in different directions, and that will make it quite nice and robust. And I'm not sort of worrying about cutting the tape. There's actually a tear is usually, it's like with wallpapering, isn't it? A tear is flatter than a cut. There's a ridge with a cut. So that's my first layer of masking tape on, all broadly going in that direction. I'm going to do this way going over next. I can go around this top with scissors, so that's okay. So I'm now putting on the final layer. So this is layer number 3, and I'm going from heel to toe, or toe to heel. So all taped up, what I'm going to do now is trim it on the sole, so I can get rid of all these bits, these loose bits here, and just cut it going around. And I should hopefully be able to lift them off. Yeah, so that's the sole area cleaned off. I'm going to try drawing my pattern on next. I'll clean up this once I've drawn my pattern. I'm going to use the shoe that I took apart as a guide for the pattern now, just to make it drawing up a bit easier. So the first sort of area I'm going to do is the top structure, and this is where I think I realise that my last ideally would have been a bit higher up the front here. Right. Quite interesting actually, the toe off, you can see the toe stiffener there. I'm going to be using some vegetarian leather for my stiffeners. This is obviously a synthetic material of some sort. I think some people use something called Podiaflex. So taking a toe as a case in point, you see I can place that on there, make sure I get it in just the right place, and then draw around it. And I know I've got my toe line roughly in. The important thing is to really squash this on. And then I can literally go over it. So I immediately have quite a good measure there for the toe piece. Got my centre line for where my laces were. I can do a similar thing to what I did with the toe piece for the heel at the back. And then I can do the front piece, the vamp, taking account of the seam obviously. So I'll carry on drawing around these bits. I'm just sketching in a bit of broguing, so this will just help me remember where the actual seam is and where the sort of line is. So you see, now I've drawn that in, when I come to draw around the vamp, I know that my cut line for the toe has got to be beyond the seam line here for the vamp, because that's obviously all hidden. That's a seam there. So I can draw the seam lines in later, but that just helps me visualise that and position it about right. So I will probably tape this bit on and get it in the right position before I draw around it. So it's a bit more floaty, but I'm going to do the heel next. So same sort of idea. Just check I've got it in the right position and I've got it central at the back, and then I can draw around it. Now the draw in the top seam of the vamp here, I've actually taped it down quite securely because I don't want it shifting around and then getting my line in the wrong place. So I can now go around this. I mean, obviously all of this is a bit of an approximation, but you just have to go with something and then hope it's about right. At least that's the way I'm working, rightly or wrongly. And I'm just doing a final check now with a bit I haven't drawn around to make sure it broadly fits in pattern wise, and that looks fine. Again, obviously there's a seam allowance one has to allow for, but the positioning is right. So I've now drawn on my pattern shapes, and I'm going to, next of all, cut around each of the pattern shapes to get my pattern pieces. I'll need to add seam allowances to all of these pieces. So I've got the toe cap off here. Obviously I'm not going to get this to lie flat. That's not too much of a worry because I'm going to be using the lasting process with lasting pliers, nails, getting a bit of leather and stretching it over the front of the last and then nailing it underneath. Now to do that I need to have about 1.5 inches of spare leather to pull it with my pliers to sort of get it drawn over and to hammer it onto the last. So what I'll be doing with this seam edge will remain as it is, and I can work out how wide that is by getting that bit flat. This bit which I can't get flat, all I'll do is I'll measure it by like rolling it like that. I can get it as if it's flat and get the distance, and then I'll add 1.5 inches all the way around this toe cap so I can grip it with my lasting pliers and pull it over the last. I can hammer the nails in and then trim it all up at the next stage. anything that's underneath, I'll be adding 1.5 inches of leather to the pattern piece. And I'm continuing to peel bits off. That's the heel. I'm now taking the vamp off. It certainly paid off giving the 3 layers of the masking tape, because it does give it a fair bit of rigidity. Well, at the moment I'm drawing out the pattern pieces, and I am finding it very helpful having the actual shoe pieces as well to give me a rough idea. What I'm doing, I'm largely going by my own pattern pieces, but at each point I'm just sort of like comparing them. So this is obviously the toe cap here, and it's pretty close. So I think that's all fine. I suspect I'm challenging myself quite a lot, making both the last and the shoe upper all as the first thing, but what I'm ending up with here, I have, for example, got one of the patterns I've completed, so I've got my lasting allowance at the bottom here, and then I've marked in my stitch lines and the eyelet holes, and I've marked where I'm going to need to skive the leather to thin it down at the edges, and I've marked my turn seam at the top, which I want to skive and then do a rolled seam. So it does get quite complicated. I've done another one here for the vamp, and again I've marked on the seam and my stitch lines where I've got my patterning around here, the broguing, and also the little crenulated gimp line. So I've got all of that marked in. Again, I've got a lasting allowance down each side, so that's marked on there. And then I've done one for the heel as well, so this is the heel one. So I'm a mass of patterns really. And again, I've got my broguing lines, a little fold line at the top, a little pleat at the back, and I'm still cross-checking with this again. Somewhere I have a heel, here it is. So I'm sort of matching it up and just checking that what I made was in the right sort of area, and by and large they have been. So I mean, here's my heel piece. That's the one off a shoe that I know fits me. But look, they're actually pretty identical. Again, quite interesting looking at this toe cap. You can remove the stiffener. So I'm going to be using leather stiffener, but this is obviously a synthetic stiffener. So that should give me a bit of a template. But I've now got the holes for the medallion. If I mark in these key big holes, I can then easily work the pattern around the big holes. They're like guide holes for doing a medallion design, which is quite useful. And also, because I've now taken the stiffening off, I can flex this out a bit more for my drawing and just check my sort of pieces, I've got them right. But I think I have got it roughly. I've had to do an assumption on this for the toe piece. So I've got my main pattern pieces cut out now, and this panel, it would just reverse around for the other side. And with the shoes, you don't have like a left or right set in as much as you just reverse everything. I've done all of these for the right shoe, but for the left shoe again, I'll just reverse them all. So that keeps that side of things easier. So that's the exterior patterns. I'll do the lining patterns next. So I've now cut out my shoe linings, and I used the same pattern pieces, but for example I incorporated the toe onto the vamp. So I've joined these two bits together, and there's no seam. Ditto with the sides. I've incorporated the back piece to the sides, and therefore I've sort of got a bigger lining piece there. And I've even got a bit of lining for the tongue as well. So that's the linings all done. So I've got all my pattern pieces now, and the next step will be to cut them all out. So I enjoyed actually making up the pattern. It's quite fiddly, you have to try and make sure you've got it right. It is worth placing your pattern pieces over your last to test them out. So I have done that. I photocopied them and put them around my last just to make sure that my sizing was about right. It always looks a bit sort of flappy. I've noticed when I've seen other shoemakers do this, you think, oh, that's very loose, but of course it all gets pulled round as you start your lasting. So that's my shoe patterns completed. The next one is cutting out, and I'll see you in that video. If you haven't subscribed, please do so, and there'll be more on this to come. Bye bye then, and thanks very much for watching. Bye bye.